any kind of incidental powers that they might want to apply, laws that they'd like to pass, cannot be greater than the list of powers. So in other words, if they're given this one mandate, they can't then use that to create some expansive power that overshadows that original mandate. Authorities of Congress with raising revenue, and actually raising revenues is the first one. These are the authorities: spending and borrowing, powers of over the economy, military powers, judicial, criminal powers, federal lands, promoting concord in the United States, and administrative powers. We're going to go through these really quickly. In the early stages of our government, under the Articles of Confederation, they didn't have taxing capability. They did have some of these other capabilities, marketing federal land, selling stamps, things like that. But it wasn't until the taxation clause in the Constitution where they could actually generate some revenue. Because up to that point under the Articles, they couldn't directly tax people. They could make requests to the states for payments for the war efforts, things like that. But oftentimes the states wouldn't even give them any money.
When did it happen that you can buy stamps anywhere now instead of just specifically at the post offices? Who gave them that power?
The money still goes back to the post office. So if you go to a grocery store and buy stamps, it's still the grocery store selling it on behalf of the post office. So it really hasn't changed that much. But when you think about forming a nation, revenue is a huge part of that. How do you get the money to actually operate government? Don't we all wish that we didn't have to pay taxes? But unfortunately, we're just not in that situation.
Weren't the taxes supposed to be apportioned, not by every? If you were going to tax, everyone had to pay the same tax.
Right, it had to be uniform. And so a lot of the earlier taxes were like impost taxes, things like that, and land sales, federal land sales. But when they had the taxation clause, they were then able to tax directly. The spending and borrowing, there's no imposed limits on spending or on borrowing, which is actually, there's a letter written by Thomas Jefferson in, I think it's 1808, where he lamented and said that the one amendment he wished was in the Constitution was a limit on borrowing, balanced budget amendment. Up until the 1930s, and I mentioned this once before, under the New Deal, Congress did not have unlimited ability to spend wherever they wanted to. And there's a federal judge in the 1930s that decided to change that. And he cited Alexander Hamilton, who had been a proponent of unlimited spending. And since that time, that opened the door. And Congress feels that they can spend money on anything they want.
But he was one voice pro against hundreds that said no.
Prior to the ratification of the Constitution, he had that idea that Congress should have unlimited spending. During the ratification debates, he changed his mind, and he said Congress should not have unlimited spending.
And then
after the Constitution was ratified, he then went back to his early. And none of the other founders or ratifiers of the Constitution agreed with him.
Well, that was he was a Rothschild.
Power over the economy. You can see this. Basically, what's kind of interesting about this is during our colonial days, the colonies had given up certain concessions to London. Those basically stayed after the Constitution was ratified. The most important powers over the economy at that time, during the ratification or after the ratification of the Constitution, were dealing with commerce. Commerce was huge. How do you have relationships between states, moving goods in and out of ports, things like that. Military powers. I talked about earlier, the whole notion of having like a military strongman. That's where Congress, having power of the purse, could kind of have a little bit of a controlling factor over the president as commander-in-chief, his ability to wage war. One of the guarantee clause in the Constitution is kind of interesting. It's basically guaranteeing that the states are Republican states, that they are a republic. So if any particular state decides that they're going to become their own little monarchy, and like California, that the guarantee clause basically says the federal government has to guarantee a Republican form of government within that state. Also, the guarantee clause means that the federal government has to come in and quell domestic violence or invasion within a state.
Wait a minute.
So, yeah, leave the border out of this. So, all kinds of different authorities that fall under military, and seeing how we're running out of time, I'm going to probably jump through these pretty quickly. The Articles of Confederation gave some authority to the government as far as like piracy at sea, offenses against natural laws, rules of engagement and rules of conduct for land and naval forces. The Constitution then added additional judicial and criminal capabilities. In a nutshell, when you're talking about the various roles of Congress, the enumerated powers, they're also able to then have criminal penalties associated with those enumerated powers. So in other words, if they have taxation and you fail to pay your taxes, they can set the penalties associated with not obeying that particular enumerated power. Yes, friendly IRS. Taxation is. IRS is.
Yeah, but IRS is.
Yeah, well, IRS is because of it was passed as an amendment, progressive tax. Federal lands, we have things like enclaves, which are, for example, the most prominent one was Washington, D.C., 100 square miles. That they can acquire land for needed purposes. So they talk about, and I actually didn't list them, but they talk about different kinds of buildings, like batteries, arsenals, things like that, forts. I believe when you're talking about in Indian territories, they wanted like like a 10 square mile area around a fort when they were dealing with hostile Indian areas. So these are some of the things that they're able to do with the lands. Now, let's see, I think it's on the next slide, is the Treaty of 1783 provided territories, U.S. territories that were outside of the boundaries of the established states, and those became federal territories. Even though that they're U.S. or federal territories, they didn't necessarily belong to the federal government specifically. They could have belonged to states. States might have had claims to them. Individuals might have had claims to them. So the Territories and Properties Clause, and is also just referred to as the Properties Clause, talked about how they had to deal with Western territories, among other things. Having the federal government control land, one thing I found kind of interesting about the book is if the land didn't serve an enumerated power, that the federal government was supposed to dispose of it. The federal government, and we should probably not have any more questions until the very end. The federal government, based upon the intent of the founders, felt that the government should control as little land as possible, that land should instead be in the hands of the states, and specifically in the hands of the people.
Now we're buying.
3 types of control of land. Control over districts and enclaves like the District of Columbia. Jurisdiction over federal territories, rulemaking authorities, These are, some of the controls of land